You can learn how to use watercolor by practicing these 7 basic techniques. If you're new to watercolor or just need a refresher on the basics, this video is for you. I will demonstrate 7 techniques you need to know to start painting with watercolor. This is a crash course on how watercolor works. This is part of my Watercolor for Beginners series. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss upcoming videos. In watercolor, you make a lighter or darker color by adding more or less water. So paint consistency equals value. Here I have a very watery mix. It's tea or coffee-like. And if I paint that on the paper, you will see that it is very light. Now, if we add more pigment to that same puddle without adding more water, it's still pretty runny, but we get a darker value on the paper. And if we do that again, adding more pigment, not adding any extra water, we can create a middle value. Let's add a little bit more. You want it to be a milk-like consistency. Okay, there's our middle value. Now, to create a darker value, I wouldn't keep adding paint to this puddle because it's still very watery and you're going to have to add a lot of pigment to that to make it darker. So instead, start a new puddle with paint directly from your palette. See how that's much thicker? And if we paint that on the paper, we get an even darker value. And if we keep adding pigment to that, it will get very sticky or cream or honey-like. And that will give us our darkest value. When you paint with watercolor on dry paper, the paint is only going to go where your brush goes. So you see on this leaf, if I leave a gap there in the middle, the paint isn't going to fill in because the paper is dry, but I can fill that in with my brush if I want to. While this shape is still wet, we can add to it and you'll see that it connects. And you can refine your shapes while they're still wet. So if I wanted to make this leaf bigger, I could. I just have to move the watercolor with my brush. You see how that flowed into that area there? On that one, I'm going to leave that white gap in the middle. So when you paint watercolor on dry paper, you get a hard edge all the way around the shape. So one common mistake that I want to show you is when you paint a shape on your paper and you think, oh, I want that a little darker, so you grab some more of that watery paint and you pile it on. But what's going to happen because you created this puddle on the paper is that paint is going to just keep spreading. The water is going to push the pigment out to the edges of this leaf shape. When this dries, you're going to get a darker edge around your shape, and that's probably not what you want. So how you avoid that is when you paint your shape, doesn't matter how much water you put on this shape when you paint it. So I have some pooling there. I'm going to blot off my brush and use it to suck up that extra water and pigment. So when I leave my shape to dry, I don't have that puddle sitting on it. And when this dries, we'll come back and take a look at the difference between those two. Okay, Now I want to show you wet on wet. We're going to come back to softening hard edges. You need to understand wet on wet first. So I have a bowl of clean water here. I'm super guilty of contaminating my water jars. So when I work wet on wet, I always keep this pretty bowl of clean water that I don't contaminate. So for wet on wet, you want to wet your paper first. So I'm just painting clean water on the paper. And I want it to be a nice, even shine on the paper. No puddles. We don't want puddles. And we don't want any dry areas. So you may have to lift your paper so that you can see the sheen on the paper. Okay. When we're painting wet on wet, I'm going to just use that same consistency paint I had over here. When you add that paint onto wet paper, it blooms out. The pigment spreads in the water. And if you paint along the edge of your shape, it's still going to spread out. It's just going to go perpendicular to the line. So now let me show you what happens if we try to paint a leaf shape on this wet paper. Couple things happening there. So the leaf shape is going to have soft edges because the pigment is spreading on the wet paper. And you notice at the end of the stroke, where the tip of my brush rested for a second, I got this big bloom happening. So watercolor on wet paper seems hard to control, but there are a few things that you can do. So the first thing I'm going to do is rinse off my brush, blot it so it's just damp, and then I can use that to straighten out these feathered shapes here. So in this case, I'm not going to get my leaf back because I had that big bloom on the edge, but I can use this brush, and I can even do it on the circle up here. So you can shape this a little bit. You can't do it too much because you'll start lifting the paint and drying that edge of the paper, and then you might get some hard edges when you're painting wet on wet, which is usually not what you want when you're doing wet on wet. So let's look at some other ways that you can control wet on wet. So again, I'm going to paint my paper here with just clear water. Same thing, I don't want any puddles of water, and I want a nice even shine. So one thing to know about wet on wet and controlling it is that your paint consistency matters, whether you're using watery paint or paint with more pigment and less water. So if we put watery paint on here, you can see how that spreads. If we add more pigment to that same puddle of paint and apply it, it doesn't spread quite as far. And if we use a really thick mix of pigment, it spreads the least. So that is one way that you can control what's happening on your wet on wet paintings. If you think this video is helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel for more watercolor tutorials. The other thing that matters when you're working wet on wet is how wet the paper is. So I'm going to wet this area again, just with my clean water. Okay, that is nice and even. And so I'm going to use, we're just going to use this slightly darker mix of paint. And if I paint that on here now, that's how much it's going to spread. Now, if we wait a minute and do that again, you're going to see that the paint spreads less because the water has started drying. So I'm going to wait a minute and then apply more paint. Okay, a minute has passed and I'm applying more paint on that same strip of paper that we wet. And you see it's already spreading less than it did here. So let's wait another minute and do that again. All right, another minute has passed. And if I look at my paper here, there is no sheen left on the area that I wet. And when I add the paint, it almost doesn't spread at all. It's fuzzing a little bit at the edges, but this was right away after we wet the paper. This was a minute later. This was 2 minutes later. So understanding how wet your paper is, along with your paint consistency, can give you more control over wet on wet techniques. All right, now let's look at softening hard edges. So we painted wet on dry here and we got all of these hard edges, but sometimes you want a mix of hard and soft, fuzzy edges. So here is one way that you can do that. So I've painted my leaf shape and now I'm going to take my brush with clean water. And if I apply clean water to the paper next to my leaf and just touch it to the leaf, I'm inviting that pigment out into that clean water. Now you're going to want to make sure to extend your clean water so that you don't get a hard edge here. And you just see how that pigment is going out there. Now, another thing you can do is let's put another leaf here that is darker. Make sure that's darker. And if I touch that to the first leaf, you will see, let me soak up some of that extra there, that darker color is bleeding into the other leaf. So where these two connect, we're losing that edge between the two leaves. All right. One more way I would like to show you. I'm going to paint a smaller leaf down here. If you're okay with giving up a little bit of control, this is a really cool technique for softening edges. So I'm just going to take a little spray bottle that does kind of a fine mist. Oh, you want a fine mist. Mine went a little overboard, but you can spray the edges of your leaf and watch them bleed out. That can be a really cool effect for the background. It does take some practice. Obviously, the spray does get everywhere. So you want to shield areas that you don't want to get wet, but it can be very cool in an initial background layer for your painting. The last thing I want to show you is ways to combine wet on dry and wet on wet. And the first one is called charging. So if I paint a leaf here, while it is still wet, I can clean off my brush and grab a different color and just drop that into the wet paint. So just like on wet, that pigment is going to bloom out within this wet shape. So let's do that again a little differently. Paint our leaf. So we're painting wet on dry, but because we just applied paint, this leaf is now wet. So while it's wet, I can get another color or a darker color, and if I drop it along the edge, it's just going to bleed up into that green color. So that's one way you can create a leaf that has two different colors. This one, I left a little bit of separation between the two halves of the leaves with that white gap there, because if I'm painting on dry, I can leave that gap and I can drop the pigment just on this lower half of the leaf. And it's not going to spread where that white line is because that is dry paper. Now you can do this charging technique with different colors like I did here, or you can do it using the same color in a thicker mix, so a darker value. You can charge that in to make one side of the leaf darker. There are lots of ways to combine wet on dry and wet on wet. In this video, I just wanted to give you the basics to understand how you can start using wet on dry and wet on wet techniques for your watercolor paintings. Before we go, I want to bring you back to this avoiding dark edges and show you, this one's not quite dry yet, but you can see right here at the top, the darker pigment edge that is forming around the edge of the leaf. And that's because as the water dries, it is pushing that pigment out, just like what happens on the wet on wet. Imagine the pigment is being pushed out by the water, but then it's hitting this hard edge, and so it's collecting at the edge. So in this one, if you remember, I showed you how to paint the leaf, and then I can do it again here. So to avoid those hard edges, you want to paint your shape, and you see how I have some water pooling there? I'm just going to blot off my brush so it's dry. That makes it a thirsty brush. And I can suck up that extra water that is on top of that shape. So when this one dries, it isn't going to have as dark of edges as this one that had a giant puddle on top of it. It's going to dry more like this one where those dark edges aren't as prominent. So just to review, paint consistency equals value. So if we have a tea-like watery consistency, we have a lighter value. If we move into a milk-like consistency where we've added more pigment, not any more water, we get a middle value. And if we have the least amount of water and the most amount of pigment, giving us a butter or honey-like consistency, we get a dark value. With wet on dry, we get hard edges, and the paint flows only where the brush goes. So to avoid hard edges, you don't want to leave a puddle of water on top of your shapes. You want to use a damp brush to suck that up and even out your shape so that you don't get those unsightly dark edges. You can soften edges by adding clean water next to a shape, inviting that pigment to disperse out into that water. My example here got a little messy because my spray bottle, I was spraying too close in this area, but similar to this, if you spray your leaf shape, mist it lightly with water, you can get the edges to soften out and diffuse. In this example, we looked at wet on wet, where we painted clear water on the paper first. So with wet on wet, we're going to get soft edges, and the paint is going to flow wherever the water goes. Doesn't matter where our brush goes. If there is water on the paper, the pigment is going to flow into that water. Then we looked at controlling wet on wet. So in this top band, we looked at how different paint consistencies, tea, milk, honey, affect how much the pigment spreads on the wet paper. So the more watery your pigment, the more it's going to spread. The thicker your pigment, less water, the less it's going to spread and the more control that you're going to have. In this band on the bottom, we looked at how wet the paper was. So we wet this entire area. We applied paint, this middle value, we applied that right away, and you can see how much it spread. A minute later, after the water had soaked into the paper more and started to dry a little, we added that same paint, and you can see it spread less. And then after another minute, when the sheen had gone off the paper and it was just damp, we added that same exact paint consistency, just like this, and you can see it hardly spread at all. It just created fuzzy edges there. And finally, we looked at how you can combine wet on dry with wet on wet using charging. So you can paint a shape wet on dry, so you have nice controlled hard edges, but then you can add in other paint, darker paint or a different color into your wet shape, and it will spread out just like it does in the wet on wet. The 7 techniques I covered today are just the beginning. In my next video, I'll show you how to paint watercolor washes and glazes. Subscribe to my channel now so you don't miss it.